So narcissism. So really, from my perspective, I guess the signs that people are narcissistic. So things that we could think about really. One, or the main thing really, I think for most of us, is a lack of empathy. So number two really on my list is kind of gaslighting. So they basically twist everything to make you doubt yourself. So for me, the third thing really is control. We've got all control manipulation that we all can associate with. So they tend to use guilt and fear or charm to sort of dominate us in that way. And then we move to kind of entitlement again. So narcissistic people seem to be very entitled. They do seem really to expect special treatment without kind of giving too much back in return. And then I guess the sort of idealism really and devaluation cycle comes round and round. 1 minute they put you on a pedestal and then they tear you back down off it again. And again, narcissistic people, that's what they're looking for. They're looking to find the trigger. And if they can find your trigger, generally they hop on it as fast as possible and keep pulling it. And then you find yourself being drawn into some big sort of traumatic chaos generally that most narcissistic people seem to like. How do we deal with them? Because of course, if you've got these people in your life, we need to deal with them. So for me, really, it's all about sort of protecting yourself, which number one thing would be boundaries. So again, when people come into your circle or people that are in your circle, if they know what you will and won't accept, then you've got that boundary, you've got that line. And the way that helps, I think, really, is it stops the narcissist from feeding from your energy, because they're effectively psychic vampires, people that are looking to vampire, to connect to our energy field and to suck that energy. So if we think about psychic protection, the things that we do and talk about every day on a daily basis, if you're in your protected bubble, then things can't connect to your field and pull that energy from you. But if you start to go into a chaotic state or an angry state or an emotional state because you're being driven by other people, then that field kind of perforates and that opens up your energy for these kind of psychic vampires, narcissistic people to connect to your field and to feed off of your energy. If we think about a person that's been born as a baby, you have a physical body being created by the mother in the womb. The spirit is then incorporated in at some point. Normally after a week or so, there's a spiritual frequency that comes in to that tiny fetus. Of course, when the child is born, the spirit is already locked inside the body, and therefore you've got an intelligent being that's actually being birthed into the physical space, physical realm. So at this point, there is no narcissism. You don't have a narcissistic baby. Babies aren't born narcissistic. They're born and they're running their program. The baby version 1 program is a very simple one with no narcissism whatsoever. And of course, as time goes by, the baby learns. The more it screams and the more intrusive it becomes to the mother, generally the faster it gets serviced. So that person starts to learn very, very young on, probably within year 1, certainly to year 3, that the more problematic their behaviour to the mother, the more they get serviced. Of course, that continues. So if the parenting's not particularly good at this point, by year 3, by year 4, then basically everything that the baby does, every time it screams and creates problems and chaos, the mother or the father intervene, give it what they want. You're starting to build this personality. Of course, that personality then is aligned with causing chaos to get what it wants. So if we fast forward maybe to year 10, year 11, by that point, of course, we've had societal guidelines overlaid. That baby is now grown up, has been to school, has been programmed into the school system. The school system basically overlays the things that you can do and the things that you can't do. Now, if that child goes through that lifetime from year 10 maybe to year 14 to 15 teenage years and doesn't really suffer with any particularly negative experience or trauma, abusive behavior, whether that be physical or sexual, then of course generally you just have habits forming. That child will become habitual in the way that they'll do things, which could be good, obviously, and could be bad. But if there's a lot of negativity, a lot of trauma that's in that child's life, again, whether that be mental, sexual, physical, or emotional, that then starts to change the program, and that child then starts to become very inward looking on itself, like it's always being outdone, feeling like something negative is happening that isn't really happening to its peers, people around it. If there are lots of control and manipulation happening, again, that child will internalize that, but generally keep it quiet. So now you have a child that basically is acting in a very different way from the rest of the programming of other children and peers around. So by the time we get to the latter teenage years, narcissistic personality disorder has already been locked in to that person's psyche, really. So you can see we've got this personality now that's starting to behave very differently from normal personalities. And then, of course, they start to look at other people around them that seemingly have a better life, an easier life. And that breeds frustration, anger, resentment, all of the negative emotions again. So you can see that when we fast forward, maybe to year 20, mid-20s, if that behaviour is continued, we now have a person that's running a very, very different emotional construct and program. And that, of course, is what you call narcissistic personality disorder. The narcissistic personality disorder has two faces. It has the sweet, nice person that can't do enough for you, but it's manipulative, always controlling. So even when they're doing nice things for you, they're looking to manipulate and control. They give you things and then take things away from you. Everything is attention-based. But again, manipulating people to get what they want and how they want things is their core program, really, that they run. So, of course, if you're in a relationship with a narcissistic personality disorder person or someone that has those traits, these are the experiences you're going to have. You're going to continually feel as though you've never got a lock on yourself. You don't have a lock on your relationship. The relationship is up and down continually. You're emotionally challenged and charged. There's chaos in and around your life. Your boundaries are being walked over continually. Because, of course, when I look at people, I don't see the physical like you. I have no eyes. What I see is a vibratory frequency. So we read these people at low frequencies. They're angry, negative people, even though they may not be presenting that way from a physical perspective. And this, of course, is where many of you listening will have got caught. You'll have met people that seem to be too good to be true. And, of course, we know that if that's the case, it's generally spot on. Someone that's appearing to be too nice and too good, generally, it is an act. They're part of a theatre show. They're just doing the things that they know work, they know you want them to do, and that's therefore what they do until they choose to change. So why do people take drugs and how do they kind of get into drugs? So let's talk about kind of drugs awareness. So core reasons, I think, from my perspective, probably self-medication is what we definitely hear every single day. People that are self-medicating are kind of finding some sort of emotional relief in the traumas and the pains they're going through. And we all know that we can turn to substance and drugs to kind of get relief really from that. So it could be alcohol. Yep, you're right. Also, of course, it could be any other type of drugs. And of course, we need to kind of throw into the mix, I think. We've got recreational drugs, which we know about, cocaine, weed, those sorts of things. But we also tend not to think about pharmaceutical drugs. And of course, pharmaceutical drugs are still drugs. And then people generally masking trauma, I guess. And then other people talk about loneliness. We have a lot of emails coming through to us talking about how lonely people feel. And I think the spiritual path really can be quite a lonely place. I remember Chen telling me years ago, this is your path. You need to walk it. If you're going to walk it, it's only your path. So it is quite a lonely place to be. I think anything that you put in your mouth that changes how you feel is a substance, is a drug in one way or another, really. So the other thing, I think, why do people get into drugs? So maybe curiosity and sensation seeking, novelty, fun, identity and rebellion kind of come up for me, really. So other reasons why people get into drugs, really. So performance is something I didn't really think about too much, and we kind of covered that earlier when we were talking. So performance enhancing stimulants. People that are on long shifts can take drugs to keep them going, to see them through a shift at work. Obviously, athletes can use them to increase their performance. And of course, sedatives. Lots of people have sleeping problems. And one of the things that happens generally when you can't sleep is you then look to a sedative to kind of help you sleep. And there's different types of sedatives. Some people use alcohol, obviously red wine, that type of thing can be quite good to to help you sleep. And then we've got social factors, I guess. So nightlife, people go out clubbing, pubbing, things become trendy, you know, people around you that are doing drugs, that are having a really good time. And we know that, you know, people that take drugs obviously have this kind of euphoric feeling they can lose themselves for a bit, lose their identity for a bit, do and say things that they probably otherwise wouldn't do or say if they weren't taking drugs. So then we can move on to kind of medical pathway. So people, why do people take drugs? For medication. So prescribed painkillers, sedatives, stimulants, those sorts of drugs can be used short term for help. But of course, they then can be used longer term, and they become part of like a misuse cycle. And then if we think about life stressors, just the stress of life, really. Chen always says to me, actually, that having a human life, you know, he says people don't come to planet Earth to have a holiday, basically. We're all incarnating on planet Earth to work. We've all come here to evolve, to learn, to progress our own soul, our own spirit, and then to kind of progress ourselves for humanity, our species. So we're all kind of connected intricately, energetically, and we're all having different experiences. And I guess all of those experiences are kind of being baked into that pie, really. So from a psychological perspective, there's a lot of things that are kind of going on. And generally, life can be difficult. Most people have money problems, housing strains, conflict in their families, bereavement, quite often, isolation. So there's lots of reasons that people would turn to drugs. So from that perspective, I guess, how does it begin? So people kind of experiment with drugs. Weekends become, you know, a kind of, let's do some drugs on a weekend, have some fun. It can become a coping loop. So people are using drugs to kind of de-stress. But the problem is, of course, with drugs, like everything, the more you take, the more your body becomes used to that. And then you need more and more. So the whole thing is a cycle that's been driven, really, which can be very difficult to break. And of course, it does take a lot of willpower and mental agility to be able to step aside from a kind of cycle that you find yourself in. Quite often we watch a choice. We may see someone go out to have a night out in their early 20s, and we think they're young, they don't really have a lot of wisdom in this particular life, they're living for the moment, they're on an emotional high, maybe a sexual high, they're enjoying themselves, they're having a great time around other people. And of course, these are circumstances that you've all experienced. Anyone that's had a physical human life will be able to understand what we're talking about. And in those moments of euphoria, whether you have taken substance already, so you could be drunk on alcohol, or you could be high on different drugs, or you could have taken other drugs that have changed your emotional and psychological state. So in those states, of course, you throw caution to the wind and you're having a wonderful time, and you take something that changes your chemistry. And of course, when your chemistry changes, then serotonin generally is dumped into the bloodstream, which is this euphoric hormone for adrenaline. And of course, you feel good, you're having a wonderful time. So doing those sorts of things occasionally is not a problem, of course. It's part of normal human experience. But of course, when people start to experience emotional highs, then the day-to-day life starts to become quite inconsequential to them. They start to find life quite boring, in fact, which would be understandable. When you've been high and you've been at your height and your emotions are running and you're having a wonderful time, or you're dancing and letting yourself go, it's a wonderful experience to have. But you know that in the morning, when you wake up, you're going to feel rather tired and rather beside yourself, because of course all of the energy is gone, the chemistry has changed, and then most people feel slightly tired, down, probably a bit depressed. Obviously, people talk about the hangover the next day, but the hangover essentially is the fact that you've partied hard, you've drunk, or you've taken things that have basically stressed your body, or they've dumped lots of hormone into your bloodstream. And then, of course, you're in the after effects, which can take days. And people that have done harder drugs that cause more serotonin release will know sometimes you feel suicidal for a few days after you've taken some of these drugs like ecstasy, because of course you've changed the chemistry so much in the brain. All of the good hormone has been released into the bloodstream and effectively burnt off. So you're left with a very tired, negative emotional state. It can feel very down and depressive. And of course, many people find themselves in this cycle with drugs because then they want the high again. They want to go back to the time that they're partying and enjoying themselves. Of course, the weekend comes. They then repeat the exercise and take other drugs that give them these emotional highs. So continually swinging from high emotion to low emotion, and lots of adrenaline, lots of energy to no energy, and extreme tiredness. And of course, this is the starting cycle really for most people. But if we think about people that have been through different types of trauma, so PTSD, some sort of abuse, whether that be physical, sexual, mental, emotional, any type of abuse, again, people look for a way out of effectively. And of course, you know that there is no way out, really, from a conventional conscious perspective. So the only way out in the physical is to find substance that changes how you think and how you feel. And of course, people find themselves on that pathway. They go off and they start to drink alcohol, they smoke some type of substance that changes the mental state again, and they move themselves into that space. But of course, you know that the more you do that, and for the longer that you do it, the next thing you notice is that you do have an addiction. So many people, I think, find themselves using drugs from an awareness perspective, starting off either recreationally or to mask pain. And of course, these are the two pathways that we see from the Spirit Guide perspective. The medical system is dealing with people from a psychological, conventional perspective, no understanding of the spiritual nature of what's going on behind the scenes. So there is a puppet, and we know that with a puppet, there's someone's hand on the top that are pulling those strings, and the puppet's arms and legs are moving up and down, and the head's moving from side to side. But if you're only able to see the puppet, you can't possibly rectify any of the problems with the puppet because you can't see the puppet master behind the scenes. And this is where we need to connect the spiritual sovereignty conversation with the medical perspective, the mental health perspective, and bring those two together so that there is collaboration. People need to be spiritually cleansed to then work through the traumas and the pain, and then the addictive aspects and the drugs and the things that they're using to cover up the pain and lead that into the medical aspect of mental health. The whole thing needs to be a pathway and a channel. And this is what we're here to try to do, is to start to collaborate and connect these different organizations or these different aspects of recovery and healing together. One thing alone only provides a certain amount of progress. So if we look at suicide as a conversation, someone that takes their own life. So certainly from my perspective, many people that take their own life, a very high percentage probably are not actually choosing to go right to the extreme end. So many people are in a very negative state emotionally and mentally. They're going through traumas, problems in their life. Many people that commit suicide are probably taking substance. So they're probably not of right mind, as we would say from that perspective. And of course, they feel as though they have no way out. So coming back to the suicide concept, when a person gets to the end of their line, they feel as though they can't go on. They're too traumatized, stressed, or angry. And of course, the big problem with that emotional state, and we talk about this a lot, is that when people get to that state of immense fear and generally immense anger, and this generally builds negative energy, negative vibration, anger and stress. And of course, we know that when we vibrate at low frequencies, when we're angry, we're stressed, we're in those negative states, we attract negative entities into our space. But from a suicide perspective, just about everyone that commits suicide that we review and see have attachment problems. So they have negative entities or negative earthbounds that are connected to them in the form of spiritual attachments, and those spiritual attachments are driving the behavior. So they are putting the negative thoughts in the mind for that person to commit suicide, to take their life. They are changing that person's energetic and emotional state, to be very angry, very negative, very frustrated with themselves. So people that get to the point that they actually do take their life generally don't really mean to. A huge percentage of those people probably don't want to take their lives. They've just been driven into this negative emotional state, a negative emotional feeling, by these spiritual attachments that we can call negative entities. So from a spiritual perspective, what we would see is that spirit obviously leaves the body in a very negative vibration, very disconnected from source, very angry, very traumatized. And then, of course, when they realize that they have taken their life, the physical body stops working. They're not able to exist in the physicality anymore. So generally, the spiritual element, the spiritual intelligence, disconnects from the physical body and moves back into spirit. Of course, again, at this time, they can be quite vulnerable because there are attachments and energies that will try to keep that spirit earthbound. So if that spiritual energy doesn't move back to spirit, they can become earthbound. And of course, they can be held in the place that they died. So many mediums will tell you, if you walk around cities and urban places where people have committed suicide, people have died, you will see the spirit just stood by the side of the road. If there's been a car accident and that spirit or person died there, if that spirit didn't move on to spirit or the light, they can become earthbound and stay in that space. The spiritual intelligence, the spirit of that person, can become locked into that space. And then, of course, they will stay there for a length of time until a psychic medium or someone that's spiritual comes along, either hears the voice or notices that person's there. And there are many people, there are many what we call cleanup crews around the planet that basically are mediums, people whose job it is to find deceased spiritual energies and move them back to the light, back to spirit, back to home. The key really is all about vibration. If someone's in a positive vibration when they die, the likelihood that they'll become earthbound is very, very small. They will be transitioned back to spirit. If people are very angry, frustrated, negative, or of course soldiers at war, most soldiers in war settings are running on high adrenaline, huge amounts of fear. Their blood is coursing with adrenaline and fear, so their vibration is very, very negative. So of course many of them obviously end up earthbound if they pass. From my perspective, it's good for you all to know that if you've lost someone to a suicide event, then you can check in with spirit and ask that the spirit of the person that committed suicide has left, has been moved back to their spiritual home, back to heaven or back to the light. And of course, this is obviously a service that we provide from that perspective. Young Andrew has that on his website. It's a service that we get asked for quite a lot. And from my perspective, the first thing we do is check in to see if that spirit is earthbound or if it's been moved back. And then we just make sure that that transition has happened and that spiritual, emotional energy of the person that died is back home with the ancestors.